Unfortunately, I can't see anybody out there, but I assume there are people there. I'll be talking primarily about West Asia, which overlaps pretty closely with what we call here the Middle East or the Near East. Some of these remarks are going to be highly critical of the practices of states in the region, including the currently most powerful states, Israel and Turkey. In a situation of conflict and threat, the state authorities will resort to any means that they can get away with. That includes serious war crimes, crimes against humanity, and they will do so as long as their crimes are tolerated and supported and sometimes encouraged by the overlord. If the master says that's enough, they stop. Therefore, it follows that our criticisms should be directed primarily to ourselves. Indignation about the crimes of others is easy and cheap and not particularly attractive, sometimes even shameful. Looking in the mirror is far more important, much more difficult, and in these and many other cases, our participation in crimes is quite real, and it proceeds at several different levels. It couldn't go on without U.S. support. The U.S. has been blocking any diplomatic settlement for about 30 years. The U.S., of course, provides the military and economic support. And when Israeli settlements spread over the region to sort of integrate into Israel, it's the U.S. taxpayer. If 50,000 people are tortured, which is the estimate, it's U.S. taxpayer. Nothing counts. When they invaded Lebanon and killed 20,000 people, it's U.S. Not only provided the means, but vetoed Security Council resolutions to try to stop it and so on. Doesn't matter. None of this is an atrocity. The only atrocity is when they do something to Israel. So now the only issue now is suicide bombers. And when did the suicide bombers begin? Last year. They're crimes, undoubtedly, terrible crimes. 1 year of Palestinian crimes against Israel after 34 years of quiet. Israel had been immune. There was some terrorist attacks on Israel, but not from within the occupied territories. The occupied territories were remarkably passive, and that's the way it's supposed to be. That's like Europe and its colonies. But when it goes the other way, it's a horrifying atrocity. And in fact, the U.S. is escalating it right now. Last December, the Security Council tried to pass a European Union-initiated resolution calling for a dispatch of monitors, international monitors, just to reduce the level of violence, and which it has that effect. If there are international observers around, it tends to reduce violence. The U.S. vetoed it. It was barely, there were a few words here, not reported. Yeah, that enhances atrocities. Back to the axis of evil. Why an axis of evil? Well, what's in the mind of George Bush's speechwriters when they give him that phrase to read? We don't have internal documents, so I'm speculating now. But a reasonable speculation, I think, is that all of this stuff is really aimed at a domestic audience primarily. Well, how do you keep people silent and submissive? Everybody understands this. The best way to control people is by fear. And the easiest way to do it is to just pull a couple of lines out of standard children's stories or ancient epics about how an evil monster is coming to destroy you, and the incarnation of actually it happened that while this stuff was going on, I was in India, and try to get to sleep at night. I was reading Indian epics, which are kind of fun. The main epic, the Ramayana, is about exactly this. I think Bush's speechwriters must have plagiarized it. The incarnation of Vishnu comes down to earth. He's the perfect man. He's going to drive evil from the world. And it comes the stories of how he does it. I mean, that had some literary value as compared with the plagiarism, but the picture is about the same. Y-axis. Well, I doubt that Bush knows what the word refers to, but the population is supposed to recognize the connotations. You know, you're supposed to think of the Nazis and Italy and Japan and so on. Well, going back to the real world again, the three countries that are the axis of evil, Iraq and Iran, have been at war for the past 20 years. North Korea has less to do with either of them than France does. North Korea is tossed in presumably for two reasons. For one thing, it's totally defenseless, therefore it's isolated, perfect target to attack, you know, easy, cheap, nobody will object. Of course, the bringing it into the axis of evil does severely increase threats in the region. South Koreans don't like it at all, or the Japanese and others, but that's a marginal issue. Furthermore, North Korea is not Muslim, so therefore it may deflect the belief that U.S. policies are targeting the Muslim world. What about Iraq? Well, Bush and Tony Blair, who the London Financial Times recently described as the U.S. ambassador to the world. The other press describes them a little less complimentary terms, America's poodle and things like that. Bush and Blair have recently, just a couple of days ago, have repeated the standard line of Clinton and others, that we've got to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He's such a criminal that he has even used chemical weapons against his own people. And that's perfectly true. He did use chemical weapons against his own people, an ultimate crime. All that's missing is that he did it with the full approval of Daddy Bush, who continued to support him right through that period and beyond, as did Britain. They thought it was just fine for him to use gas against his own people, to develop weapons of mass destruction, which he was doing with the support of the United States and Britain, which continued irrespective of his atrocities, because he was useful at that time. I mean, it's true that he's a monster. He was much more of a monster then. It's probably true that he's developing weapons of mass destruction. Then he was certainly doing it with our support, and he was far more dangerous, way more powerful and much more dangerous. He's a threat to anybody within his reach, but the reach is much smaller now. He's evil, all right, but his crimes can't possibly be the reason for the planned attack.